The video begins with the text Pyaar Plus presents in pink on a yellow background. In this video, Yashna Vishwanathan, a counselor and mental health worker, is in conversation with Candice DSouza, a disability and queer affirmative therapist, where they speak to us about the importance of therapists being affirmative about sexuality for people with disabilities.
Hi, Candice. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this conversation. I think I'm particularly excited about this significant conversation and excited more about what you are going to bring in rather than what I have to ask. So maybe, Candice, if we could start by having an introduction of yours, anything that you may want to say.
Yeah, so hi, so I'm Candice, and I did my bachelor's in psychology at Xavier's and followed that up with a master's in counseling at SNDT. I've been working as a psychology teacher and a therapist at a group practice setting in Bombay, and I have also worked with queer clients and clients with disabilities and chronic illnesses, largely because I also live with neurodivergence myself, and I live with cerebral palsy. So it's been working with mental health and marginalization has been an area of interest for a long time. So I think this conversation is something even I'm really looking forward to. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And, sort of knowing a little bit from you, I'm really sort of curious to locate our conversation into when we think about disabled women, queer and trans folks, and sexuality. What might be some ideas you think therapists carry into therapy rooms in their work with the community? What might be those dominant ideas, so to say?
I think a lot of ideas that therapists hold, also because the profession is designed that way, can be in many ways very ableist. I know that this can be triggering to hear because we are both from the system, but it's true that there will be a lot of ideas because most therapists, largely, unfortunately, because of the way the education system for this profession is structured, there may not be as many mm, disabled therapists or therapists who are chronically ill, neurodivergent, or even queer trans because of the kind of barriers that these populations might face in accessing the kind of higher education and training that's necessary for these professions. So they may naturally come in with able-bodied privilege, with biases towards heteronormativity and ableism. And I think that because it's also so pervasive, even with a disability, I do find even myself grappling with biases and ideas of that kind. So I think some of the ideas, firstly, would be linking disability and sexuality itself is so hard because the general perception of people with disabilities is that because they have so much else to contend with, sexuality will take a back seat or gender identity will be the default because they are being looked after largely in the working with the assumption that they are still being provided with care. One might assume that their care providers and doctors and other people have just treated them as most society and most authority figures do, in a very gendered way, and therefore that they may not have had time to really um, question or figure where on the gender continuum they lie. And when they do mention sexuality, queerness, or having identifying as trans, it can become difficult because firstly to put ourselves in their shoes, because the dual marginalization that comes with being both disabled and queer is a lot of systemic and structurally induced stress. And also the biases may come in when you start talking about it in the context of, say, if they were to talk to you about reproductive health, the first thought that most people have when a disabled person talks about reproductive health is, are you fit to have a child? should you be having a child? Would you be able to take care of the child? Um, and if, say if they were to talk about contraception, about sexuality, about feeling gender dysphoria, the natural assumption perhaps would be that, you know, that's a later concern. Let's talk about, the bias would naturally be towards thinking that a disabled client is coming in to talk about their disability, which is not necessarily an issue, because for most people, at least those of us, of course, when it's an acquired disability, it's a very different context, because it will cause adjustment problems, it will cause distress. But for someone who's lived with a disability their whole lives, like someone who's known they've had cerebral palsy or ADHD or been born blind or with low vision, that's a part of who they are. That's the only normal they have known. That's not going to be, of course, it's a source of stress because the system is not designed for us. But that's not always the only reason. Like, you wouldn't assume with a queer client that they're coming in to deal with their queerness. You don't want to assume with a disabled client that they're coming in to deal with their disability. They may be coming in with, topics that are relationship issues, partner issues. And most people say, if I were to say that I'm disabled and I'm queer and I'm in a relationship, the first assumption is, oh, your partner is doing so much to look after you, how can you want to break up with them? And that's the general, idea. Most therapists, of course, will contend with not bringing those ideas into the therapy room, but it's also a very human thing because we've lived in that kind of system, right? It happens. So I think these are some of the ones I can really think of.
There is an invisibilizing um, of when queer and trans disabled folks mention about sexuality, about contraceptive, so to say, right? And what might these what might holding these ideas, or not even knowing that I'm impacted by these ideas, have an effect on the community itself, have an effect on disabled women, queer and trans community? How might it affect their sense of self, their wanting to explore their sexuality, or feeling a sense of agency, or even their overall well-being?
I think there are so many aspects to this that I don't know where to start, but I think it might start with, very insidiously with not wanting to even think in that direction, in the direction of sexuality and gender identity initially, because there's so much shame and guilt and conditioning associated with saying, oh, but you're special, you're different, or being infantilized also, because even disabled adults, if not in the workplace, then at home, and if not at home, then in the workplace, are treated in a very infantilized way. So when they start to talk about sexuality, it can be ridden with a lot of shame, hesitation, and guilt. And if the therapist comes in with those ideas, and if they have even one experience where a therapist misgenders them or says, are you sure this is how you feel? Because also with a lot of physical disability, say I have a speech disability, or say I have mm, I speak a certain way that makes me sound like I don't have my thoughts collected. Say I speak with a stutter. The assumption may be that I don't know what I want, right? Which is the assumption underlying most interactions with disabled people. That even in general, say I give you a very innocuous example, that I'm going somewhere, say with another adult, to a restaurant, everyone will look to the able-bodied person I'm with and say, okay, tell us what you want to order, without assuming that I might have a mind of my own. Therefore, if I now start talking about being queer or being trans or being NB for that matter, the assumption will be, do you even know what you want? And that idea itself can be so triggering that many of them will feel guilt and shame talking about it, because don't I have bigger problems to contend with? That's what they've been told, that your disability is your biggest problem, focus on overcoming that. But there's no overcoming to be done. The system has to change for them to adjust.
what stance do you think therapy spaces could hold in approaching conversations around sexuality with the community, and why might holding that stance or trying to move towards that stance be important?
Especially as a therapist with a disability working with clients with disabilities, I know that there is going to be, as in narrative therapy they say, a lot of resonance with those issues. So that that resonance doesn't translate into damage, we want to stay in our own therapy, do our own work, ensure that we are educated not through our clients but for our clients through reliable sources, and also holding a queer affirmative as well as a disability affirmative stance. So a queer affirmative stance might look like holding space for that neutrality of, even when they don't know exactly where they fall on the spectrum of queer trans identity, holding space for the questioning stance that the client has, to wait and say that this is not uncertainty that comes from your not knowing who you are because you're disabled and you're not functioning properly, but instead looking at it like you would with any other queer able-bodied client and saying, you know, um, I understand that it might take some time for you to really put the word to it, or you may not want a label. And also at the same time, not looking at it exactly the same way as you. I know I'm contradicting myself, but you won't look at it exactly the same way you would with an able bodied queer person, because you want to acknowledge the marginalization that comes with both identities, and how when they are combined, it makes you uh, the marginalized within the marginalized, for lack of a better word, right? Because your able-bodied queer counterparts are going to be ableist with you, and your disabled straight counterparts are going to be prejudiced towards your queerness. So that duality and the stress that comes with that is something you want to be informed about. And being disability affirmative could look like, of course, educating yourself about neurodivergence, about the challenges, not just physically or mentally with the disability, but also socially, right? To have, as we say with respect to disability, the therapist needs to have what we say the social model of disability, right? An understanding of disability as rooted in the system and not in the person or not in medicine, because we are, and that includes me, disabled more by the way this country and this society sees our disability than our bodies themselves. For example, if you build the medical, if medical education, MBBS degrees were more informed about healthcare for the queer community, or healthcare for adults with disabilities. I don't know, but maybe in your own work, you may have seen that the kind of treatment and support that a child with a disability gets ends at some point. And then when they are adults, a lot of disabilities do not receive that kind of care. Perhaps neurodivergence may still receive that kind of care, but physical and intellectual disability as adults, there is definitely a paucity of care. And that can then add to that feeling of not knowing, right? Because the doctors don't know, the therapists don't know, no one knows how to look after or how to support people coming from those marginalized identities. So, wanting to perhaps hold a stance that is non judgmental, compassionate, and exploratory, and accepts that, you know, even a disabled person has agency to decide what they want to do with their body. If they want to have children, if they feel they are fit to have children, they can have children. If they need support, that doesn't make them a bad parent. Any parent needs support, right? It's impossible to raise a child alone. As they say, it takes a village to raise a child. You want to accept choices that they make in therapy. They may sometimes make the same kind of mistakes. I'm saying that in quotations, as your other clients. You don't want to judge that as, oh, they're behaving this way because they lack the maturity that comes with so-called an able brain, right? just to put that's a very, very nutshell version. It's of course a much, much larger conversation.
I just feel like this was such an invitation for, I think, people who are also a part of this conversation to think about so many questions that we may be still grappling with in the therapy space itself, and do that constant reflection, right? And how significant some of your reflections were to contribute to that. So thank you so much for your time and labor today.
This video ends with two logos on a yellow background. The first one is a pink heart and a plus sign and has Pyaar Plus written underneath. And the second one is a green and black eye and has point of view written next to it.